Welcome to Wayward Writers. I'm senior literary agent and author Heather Cashman.
I'm author and writing coach Stephanie Beers.
And I'm author and writing coach Nikki Jacobsmeyer.
Our mission is to nurture and enrich established writers throughout their publishing journeys.
We welcome all genres, age groups, and publishing paths through video podcasts, online webinars, in-person retreats, and more.
We're here to help you conquer your path.
We're excited today to have with us Karen Odden, and I am by myself today. So we are going to just have a great conversation here, and I'm going to tell you all about Karen. USA Today bestselling author Karen Odden received her PhD in English from NYU and taught at UW-Milwaukee before turning to fiction. Under a Veiled Moon came out in 2022 and is her fifth Victorian mystery. And we will have the link for you to connect with Karen in our show notes. So welcome, Karen. We're so glad to have you today.
Thanks so much. It's a pleasure to be here.
So will you share with us how you got into writing and your publishing journey?
Sure, I'm happy to. I always feel like this is a fun way to begin because everyone's got something different.
Yeah.
So in the late 90s, I was actually working at Christie's Auction House in New York, which eventually became the basis for my third book, A Trace of Deceit, which is set in the art world in London.
Yeah.
Anyway, and I was working at Christie's and going half out of my mind. An exciting place to work, but it was also challenging in many ways. So I had done my master's at Michigan several years before, but I knew I was not ready to do a PhD in English yet. I was really young. I was in with a bunch of people who were talking about post-structuralism and feminist theory and post-colonial theory and Michel Foucault, and I didn't even know what that was. And so I scooted out of the program at Michigan, went to work for a few years, got to Christie's, worked there for a bit and thought, you know what, I think it's time for me to go back. I really want to try and go back and get my PhD. And so we were in New York at the time. My husband was actually in grad school there. And I thought, okay, let me just apply to some programs, see how I do. And then I was accepted at NYU. And my very first semester there, I took a really wonderful class with a professor named Carolyn Dever. It was called The Dead Mother. And it was about all these orphans running around Victorian London.
Wow.
And I got completely hooked on the Victorian novel, even more than I had ever been, although I'd always loved Dickens. And anyway, so by the time I came around to doing my dissertation, what I was really interested in was this very curious thing that I discovered, which is that railways had completely transformed England, like our internet transformed our world. And that people were crawling out of railway disasters. People like Charles Dickens were crawling out of train wrecks. And then belatedly experiencing things like memory loss, hearing loss, nightmares, and all this. And it was basically PTSD. They called it railway spine. They didn't know. So I wrote my dissertation about the ways that the novels and the medical treatises and legal treatises and parliamentary papers created a discursive web that became the foundation for what later became hysteria for Freud, for World War I, and PTSD for us.
Right.
So that's what I was interested in. But of course,
fascinating.
I spent 2 years becoming a train nerd. I could have worn train socks with the best of them. And and so then I went on to teach. I did a couple other things, finished my dissertation, blah, 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 whatever. And then in about 2005 or 6, I was here in Arizona with my kids, staying at home. And I thought, what if I wanted to try and write a novel? And I had written a really bad one back in my 20s that was like laughably bad. I found it a couple of weeks ago and I was like, oh, this is dreadful. I wouldn't toss it. Anyway, everyone says every author has something in the drawer, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
But I thought, what do I know about that hasn't been done a million times? And so I thought, I know a lot about trains and I know a lot about 1870s London. So I put Lady Elizabeth Fraser and her poor laudanum-addicted mother on a train, and I ran it off the rails in 1874 and had a sabotage and a mystery and a romance. And that became my first book, A Lady in the Smoke. And then after that, I just ended up staying in the period. 1870s London is It's familiar to me. I've been studying it for over 20 years. So it's easy to slip into and find a story there.
That is so fun. I
Yeah.
love it. So, what types of mysteries have you published?
It's all been 1870s
Okay.
London. The first one was actually only an ebook and an audiobook. It was put out by Random House. And then the next two were HarperCollins. And then all three of those were young women amateur sleuths, young women thrown into a difficult situation because someone they love is either murdered or injured or something. Those were the first three. And then the last two, I was writing about something very different. I wanted to write a story about injustice and revenge. I was about 10 pages into that one, which became Down a Dark River, when I realized that a young amateur woman sleuth was not going to cut it. I needed a Scotland Yard inspector. I needed a man. It's the only time I'm ever going to say that. But I needed an inspector. I needed somebody who could go up against judges and murderers and con men and lawyers and all this kind of thing. And so that was where Michael Corvin was born. Yeah.
Wonderful. Yeah, sometimes the story just requires what it requires.
Yeah.
So, your book covers are really beautiful. We love your book covers. Did you get input in the covers during the process?
I've been lucky. I did. They've been done, of course, in-house by the publishing company. But for example, with A Lady in the Smoke, the first thing that they showed me was a young woman in a sort of lacy garment looking away with her hand kind of up by her pearls and a train in the background in the smoke. Except that the train was not even the kind of train you ever saw in Victoria. The train didn't even come into being that way until the 1920s. And lacy garment in Victorian England would be a nightgown. And so I went back to my agent and I said, this isn't accurate. And unfortunately, I had this wonderful editor who said, okay, show me what's accurate. Show me a gown, show me a train. And so I did. And we ended up with what I thought was a really spectacular cover.
Yeah.
For that one. And we've had a couple other things with The Trace of Deceit, which was the book about art. The original painting in the corner was just this sort of red blobby thing, a little modern, oddly. And I said, hey, the painting that gets stolen is of Francois Boucher. It's French. And it's in its public domain because it's old. So can we put that in instead? And they said, sure, fine. So I've had a little bit of input here and there, but the designs are generally speaking the artists, and I think they're beautiful. I've been lucky.
Yeah. Yeah. I think most of my clients who are authors have also had a lot of consultation with their stuff. And I think editors really do try. They really do try to be that bridge between the sales and marketing team and the author. And it's been a good experience. Can you explain the phrase, "What is the why?" from your website, please?
So this is actually a line from Michael Chabon's book, The Amazing Adventures of Cavalier and Clay. For those who haven't read it, it's phenomenal. I'm not the only one who thinks so. It won a Pulitzer in 2001. But it's about these two young men, Joe and Sammy. And Joe is an artist and Sammy is a writer. It's in like the 1940s, 50s, mid-century. And they have been asked by a comic book company to come up with a new superhero to go up against like Superman and that kind of thing. And so they're sitting around spitballing ideas back and forth. And finally, Sammy says, yeah, but like, these are all so boring. He says, so who cares if you can wear a cape or turn into a can of corn? And Sammy says something like, it's to fight crime. And he said, yeah, but it doesn't go anywhere. He said, now think about Batman, though. Batman saw his parents murdered in cold blood in front of his face. And Joe says, yeah, so it's revenge. And Sammy says, it's interesting that we have a why. And he says, we need to figure out what is the why. And then Joe replies, what is the why? And I think it's the author's way of pointing to us to say that we as human beings, we like to make sense of people's actions. We like to feel that there is a deep and systemic connection between what somebody does and why they're doing it. That's where the title came from. And that's the impulse behind the workshop, is to help people dive deep and figure out when you've got a character who is doing things, Can you build out that backstory to make sure that they feel coherent and round, and they have a strong moral center, and they have a set of assumptions and ways of looking at the world that cohere and don't change on a dime in the middle of the book, which I know we've all read books where that happens to a character and you're kind of like, so
Yeah.
that's the book, that's what the workshop's about.
What are your first steps in creating backstories for your characters? Do you tackle it differently for primary versus secondary characters?
That's a really great question, because I'd never thought about the difference, but there is one. Namely, and this is something I mentioned earlier, that I know it's probably going to sound like a crime to say this, but I actually begin with a story, not a character. I begin with a plot. I begin with a thing that I want to talk about. And just as an example, I'm going to talk about Down a Dark River, which was my fourth book. And so this came about because I read an article, and I think it was in the New Yorker or the Atlantic. I can't remember, and I still can't find the article, but it was unusually, because usually I begin with all these Victorian novels with some piece of Victorian history or something that, whatever. But this one began with a story that I read about contemporary US, and it was about a young woman in Alabama who was walking across a quiet street. She was jaywalking, and a car came around the corner and hit her. The car was speeding. The driver was under the influence, and she was put in the hospital for months. The father brought the case, and the judge heard the case, and he ordered her $2,000. Now, there may have been some mitigating factors here. Partly may have been that she was Black and the driver of the car was white and a man. And what caught my eye, though, I mean, there's all kinds of things wrong with the story, of course, but what caught my eye was that the father threatened the judge's daughter. And I got thinking about how when you're faced with an injustice that there seems to be no answer, revenge isn't simple. Revenge is in some ways like a shaking of the person by the shoulders. Do you get it? And I wanted to talk about this link between injustice and revenge. My first three books had all been these stories with young amateur sleuths, young women, amateur sleuths in London, doing unusual things, not out of the box things, because I kept them very firmly Victorian, but unusual things. But I got 10 pages into writing this book and I realized I need a man. That's where Inspector Corrigan came into being. And as I said earlier, and so I began with the story, and then I started putting him together. I had done a lot of research on detectives and inspectors. There's a really wonderful book by Haya Shpeir-Makov called The Rise of the Detective in Victorian England. And it's got a lot of first-person accounts about Scotland Yard and inspectors and where they found how they brought up uniformed constables into the ranks and all these other things. And there's a lot of really great information in there. So I started putting him together. But then as far as his personal stuff, I started really digging in, and what I use, and I know that we were going to talk about this a little bit later, so we can talk about it now or later, I guess. But what I use is this idea that Dan McAdams, he's a professor at Northwestern, what he came up with in his books, and his book is called The Stories We Live By. And the subtitle is Personal Myths and the Making of the Self. And when I read this book, I began to assemble what I consider the 7-part personal myth structure. That it's because I was born this, with or without this, and because this happened this, I came to believe this about myself, this about other people, this about the world, and I came to desire this. And when I begin, I can't fill all those pieces out. I usually can start filling them out really well by about halfway to 3/4 of the way through writing the book. But by the time I finish the book, I have to have all that solidly in place so that when I go back through the book the second time, I know how he is going to act and why. And the example I often give is that your primary character, if you have two people approaching a dead body, like Inspector Corrigan and his sidekick, Gordon Stiles, they're going to approach things differently, they're going to perceive it differently, and they're going to make meaning out of what they see differently depending on their backstory. Because you never want to have two people seeing things the exact same way in the same scene. That 7-part structure, though, came out of McAdams' book. And I've just found his thinking on it really important. So that's where I begin with my primary characters. And then with my secondary characters, I've got the story in place. If the story was the impetus for the primary, then the secondary characters often come into being in response to the primary character, if that makes sense.
And then those secondary characters would have to, like you said, have a different perspective and be a different person. So you already know what they're not, at least.
Yes, yes.
Right.
And they do have, and they develop a personal myth of their own. And one of the things I
Right.
do is write, for example, for Gordon Stiles, I write what I call the bio sheet, and it's in his voice. He's more educated. He went to what they call public school, it's private school in England. He likes reading poetry. So when he describes himself, I have him do it from the perspective of I. My name is Gordon Stiles. I'm 22
Oh,
years old.
that's so
I'm the youngest
fascinating.
inspectors at the yard. I grew up far from the madding crowd with my mother and father and my 3 sisters outside of London. It's in his voice, and he's standing on his own 2 feet. He's not built. He's built in relation to Corbin, but he's also got his own stuff,
Yeah.
his own things that he worries about that have nothing to do with Corbin's plot.
Yeah. I
So
love
that
it because that's what makes them feel real. So do you have, so that obviously is foundational, the 7 myths. Do you have other tools or resources that you use to build backstory?
Yeah. So, yeah, like I said, the personal myth has those 7 fill in the blank things. But then I start thinking about these 2 factors that really shape backstory as well. One of them is called the worldly realm, and the other one is the personal realm. And when I think about the worldly realm, it's aspects of the world that are not going to be personal and specific to my protagonist. For example, you cannot write a book now set in, say, 2021 without referring to COVID, without social media in it, and without cell phones in it, unless you're living somewhere it's very extraordinary. Those things are going to work their way into your book. They're part of the worldly realm. For example, the same way in Victorian England, the old system of coverture. It's part of the world. It dictates possibilities for my protagonist. Coverture meant that a married woman could not own property until well into the 1880s, 90s. They were just beginning to change that. So this sets up certain expectations and possibilities that, first of all, I think it's important to maintain those so that your book feels genuinely set in a period if you're writing historical. But also, it shapes how your character is going to engage in the world. Like, she can't just get married and then say, oh, forget it, I'm going to get a divorce. She can't testify on her own behalf in court. She would have to prove that her husband had both been unfaithful, and that he'd either beaten her or left her abandoned for 4 years in order to get a divorce. So that's
Whoa.
a real thing. Like, she can't just waltz in and say, okay, now I'm done being married. And not to
Right.
mention the kids belong to him and all of her property belongs to him. So she would be completely penniless and destitute. Like, the clothes she has on her body belong to him.
Right.
So when you think about how things like laws, or for example, systemic misogyny or systemic racism, or any of the things going on in our world now, that's part of what I call the worldly realm. And it doesn't always have to be things like that are directly affecting. For example, in 1912 or whatever it was, the sinking of the Titanic, maybe you didn't know that anyone on the Titanic, maybe it wasn't your parents on the Titanic, but maybe you're the kind of person who thinks, oh my God, transportation of all kinds isn't safe. I'm going to resort to only walking.
Right.
Who knows? Depending on who your character is, they're going to respond different ways. Or the person's going to think to themselves, serves them right, all those rich people getting to go to America. Depending on who your main character is, they're going to have a different response. Everyone's going to respond differently to this thing that looms large in the social consciousness. And then you've got the flip side, which is what I call the personal realm. And that's all the stuff we talk about, their family of origin and who they formed bonds with and who made fun of them at school, and did they have a teacher that they loved, or what was their main talent? Were they diagnosed with diabetes at age 12? All the stuff that's personal to them that isn't necessarily shared across the world. So those, if you start thinking about all those things, you can put them together and people's assumptions and beliefs and things like that can come out of it. Is always shaped within those 2 constraints.
The whole person, like having both their world and then their personal issues and experiences. So when you have all of this stuff that you know about your character, how do you balance revealing this backstory that needs to be in your book? I mean, of course, there's going to be backstory you don't want to have included in your book that the reader doesn't ever need to know. But how do you include enough backstory and reveal that to your reader without overwhelming the present narrative?
Oh, it's a great question. I mean, it's like yeah, because it's like the dreaded info dump, right? Like you. Okay, so I have a couple guidelines. All right, but first I'm going to tell a funny story because it's a ridiculous story and it's laughing at me, and that's always fun, right? So when I was first writing A Lady in the Smoke, as I said, I had done my PhD on Victorian railways and their, results, okay, and the trauma and everything that they caused. And I had become truly engrossed in it. And I had just heaps of information. I read for almost 2 years, gathering all this stuff together. So when I sat down to write A Lady in the Smoke, wrote the whole entire thing. I sent it out. I thought it was a young adult novel at the time. My heroine was 16. And so I'm sending out to all these agents, getting lots of rejections, getting lots of nothing. This was back in the day when you were sending out submissions like snail mail, and I'd get a sad little slip of paper back saying, this is not suitable for us at this time. And I was so naive. I thought that they would actually save it and look at it later. Anyway, I rewrote it again, of course, and sent out to some more agents and rewrote it again. And I was in the process of learning a lot, right? And I was like reading books about writing and reading other authors and going to SCBWI conferences because, again, I thought I was still in YA. And eventually I decided to give up because I had sent it out to 50 agents. I hadn't had even a single nibble. And a friend of mine had just gone to a literary conference, and she had met a woman who would do some freelance editing. Her name was Maisie Coker, and she works for Tin House now as an editor. And she said, my friend Mame said, hey, why don't you get in touch with her and see if she would help you out? And I said, okay, that sounds like a good idea. So I reached out, and I could hear Maisie's hesitation over the phone. Oh, good. A friend of a friend's. And anyway, so I sent the book to her, and she calls me a week later and says, look, this is promising. You've got good characters, clearly a depth of historical knowledge here. You've got a good mystery. You have a sweet romance. But I need to know if we can work together. And this, I'm going to just tear off the Band-Aid. You need to take the first 7 chapters and throw them away. And I was like, yeah, of course. And they say about murdering your darlings. Anyway, and she said, she explained it this way, because I said the first 7 chapters are what lay the foundation. There's information about railway narrow gauges and wide gauges and carriages and engines and Lady Elizabeth's relationship with her mother and her mother's affair with the neighbor and her father's affair with the neighbor and all these things about railways and trauma and blah, blah, blah. And she said, yes. And she said she made this important distinction, which is that all of that is backstory. It belongs in your head as you are writing. It does not belong in your first 7 chapters. Chapter 8 is your train wreck. That is your inciting event. That is where your book begins. And I said, oh. So I took the 7 chapters, shoved them into a separate Word document. And of course, all of that stuff filtered in eventually into the book. It feathered in lightly at certain places. But she was exactly right. And that revision, I mean, we worked together for about 3 months, and that revision eventually did get me an agent and did get me published. But what I came to understand is first of all, you have to begin your book in the right place. You need that inciting event relatively soon. And people say, oh, that isn't true for every novel. And maybe it isn't. But I take a look at something like Great Expectations by Dickens, which was one of those big, baggy Victorian monsters, right? That first chapter, Pip is sitting there in the graveyard, and Magwitch comes running up to him and says, get me food and get me a file. We have that moment where everything changes. And so I guess the story that I'm telling is that we have to make a distinction between the backstory that you hold to the side or hold in your head as you're writing and the backstory you include. And my general guidelines are, if you're trying to get the pieces of worldly realm in, you feather it in during action scenes. And if you're trying to get the pieces of personal realm in, you tuck those flashbacks in during quiet moments, like when someone is sitting in a car ride or walking to Whitechapel for 20 minutes and they have 20 minutes to think about their childhood in Whitechapel or whatever it is. So that's the distinction I make. So worldly, but the worldly elements, like the fact that medicine was changing, that can be worked in as the doctor pulls out his stethoscope. Scenes. And then, but those larger chunks that risk becoming info dumps, I tuck them in during the kind of the quieter moments. We all know not to put sensitive memory kind of stuff during a knife fight, but
Right.
but to do it during a moment of relative quiet in the narrative, I think works well, especially if you can link it somehow. If you're going to walk to Whitechapel, you can talk about your childhood in Whitechapel, or just connect it through the space or time or something.
And it sounds like that is the framework for uncovering those deeper motivations of your characters and those internal conflicts is you just couch them in the quiet moments.
Yeah. Because I think that when you're thinking about backstory, we all have, I would say, maybe half a dozen really formative experiences that help us assemble our personal myth. And actually, I'm going to just read really quickly this one little section here from the introduction of Dan's book, because I think it's relevant. He says, and this really was regarded as a epistemological change for psychology as a study, because he abandoned all these static models that had been in place, and he was like, nope, we're doing this instead. This is not static anymore. This is going to be something that transforms over time and so on, until you're roughly around 20, when your personal myth pretty much takes hold. That's what he says. We are all tellers of tales. We each seek to provide our scattered and often confusing experiences with a sense of coherence by arranging the episodes of our lives into stories. This is not the stuff of delusion or self-deception. We're not telling ourselves lies. Rather, through our personal myths, each of us discovers what is true and what is meaningful in life. Enduring human truths still reside primarily in myth, as they have done for centuries. And he talks about building the heroic story of the self. So, yeah.
I love that.
Yeah.
I want to read that.
Yeah. It's a little bit dense going. It took me a while to work my way through, but it's definitely a really good book. Yeah.
Yeah. So, how does a well developed backstory naturally lead to these authentic conflicts that are the flip side of those quiet moments?
The example that I like to use, because when I first gave this workshop, it was a couple of years ago, and The Queen's Gambit was
Mm,
really big. It was on
yeah.
Netflix. I don't know if you watched it. It was fantastic, a 7-part kind of miniseries. And it's about a young woman who is who's a chess prodigy. And she has a range of experiences, these early formative moments that set her up to create a personal myth that goes something like this. Because I was born to a mother who is suicidal and bipolar, and because my father left me, and because my adopted father left me, and because my adoptive mother died, and I went to a orphanage where I was fed painkillers and narcotics to sleep and so on, I came to believe that men were not to be trusted, and that they would want to hurt me, and that it's okay to escape through drugs and alcohol. Okay. And what I desire most of all is to be a chess champion, because on the board I can control everything. So that would be a version of her personal myth. But what's interesting is her very strong secondary character. Benny and she are naturally in conflict because both of them want to be chess champion, and there can only be one. So at the level of plot, they are a perfect match for each other. But his personal myth runs something like this: that I've always been a chess champion, and I grew up without much else in my life. And so I believe that maybe that's all I am. Maybe if I weren't a chess champion, nobody would like me. That's a scary thought. So I have found a way to connect with people through teaching them. And when I teach them, I want to be appreciated, and I want to be valued for what I have to offer. Okay, so you've got on one hand Beth Harmon, who thinks all men are out to hurt her, and she doesn't trust any of them. And you've got Benny, who just wants to be appreciated for what he gives. But the level of personal myth, you see why you see why they crash. So there's conflict at the level of plot because they both want to be champion, and then there's conflict at the level of personal myth. And what's so beautifully done, I think, in the Netflix series is that at the very end, when she is up against the Russian and they time out for the day, and she has pushed all of these men because she's really in a world of men. It's mostly world chess world at that point in 1960s in Ohio. But she has pushed all of them away. But so when she stands up for the board, she walks down the hall and she sees the Russian go and meet with 5 of his cronies. And they all get together and they start talking about his next move and her next move and what's going to happen. She has no one. And she goes to her hotel room and the phone rings and it's Benny. And he has overcome his own need to be appreciated enough that he says, hey, we're all here. All of us are standing here in this room. We've all been following the game. Let's game out the next few moves for you. And by overcoming his own personal myth, helps her get past the belief that she's alone and men can't be trusted. He has to let that go. And when she does, she gets to win. So she gets what she wants most of all, but only by changing her personal myth, nudging it off center, not nudging it off of her mother from the very beginning told her men are not to be trusted and you will be alone someday. Those were her primary beliefs. And she's had to abandon them. And it's hard. And I think it's beautiful. Some novels show it beautifully, how hard it is to give up that thing, especially when your parents gone, because that's what you have of them.
Yeah.
Not to mention that once we've formed our personal myth, we have confirmation bias and we seek things that confirm it.
Confirm it, yeah.
That's why one of the things McAdams points out is usually by sort of early 20s, you've got this personal myth and it is very hard to move off of that personal myth, even if circumstances change and it no longer holds true. If that makes sense?
I feel like I'm having a therapy session. Yeah.
I don't really know how because I don't write those genres, but when I teach workshops, it's always interesting to me because I'll pose these questions. And just to come completely clean, I did have 5 years of therapy. So yes, I'm definitely the therapeutic model here. When I teach this workshop, I will have someone who is writing memoir and who says, these are really hard questions.
Yeah.
I understand. I say, of course it's hard. You're excavating pieces that that are almost so worked into the way you are, you don't even recognize that they're there. So I know people who write memoir and have taken my backstory workshops and my secondaries have said that they're useful for them because they get them thinking about some of those formative events and how they have created this belief system they put together by the time you're in your sort of late adolescence, early 20s. So I know that's true. And when I read some of these really brilliant books that have characters that have these deep backstories and longings and wishes that they can trace back. And I marvel at them. Maybe they aren't using the personal myth structure. Maybe that's just how they write, which I think is brilliant. But I really need to be very mindful about creating it. It doesn't come to me naturally.
Yeah. And I think that deep down, like characters in story, I think no matter the time period or the genre are essentially the same. I think the differences come when you start wanting to feed those into the worldview or how you were saying the world is different. And I think too that people expect a certain type of character in certain genres, possibly. But I think that's also how you can play with and make yours maybe stand out by making them a little bit different or defying those expectations.
Yes. Yes, I completely agree. I did this for a romance writing group. And one of the things they pointed out is that in a romance, it may be focalized through the woman more than the man, for example. But they said what we really want is we want to watch both of them change their personal myth.
Yes.
So that the woman has to change a little bit and the man or the partner or whoever, the other woman or whatever They both change. They change each other. And how does that happen? That's like some of the magic, right? And the more unique their backstories, the more interesting that change can be, I think. Yeah.
Yeah.
Just keep writing. Honestly, I go back to that. I would say it was a month where I really seriously thought about giving up. I was going to give up and become a social worker and go back to grad school. And I was lucky enough that I had a friend who just gave me that one final shove towards somebody who could help. Because I had a lot to learn. And I knew I did, but I just didn't know where to learn it or how to learn it or what I was doing wrong. I would change a sentence and then change it back because I didn't know if it was better or worse. So I keep writing. I really do believe, even if you have only time to write 15 minutes, just write every single day. The same way you'd brush your teeth. You don't leave it. Just feels yucky the next morning. So yeah, and find the books that you truly love and really tease them apart. See if you can find the personal myth. Like one of the books that I go back to and I reread every couple of years is Tana French's Faithful Place, which I think is a masterful mystery. I think it's her best one. It's my favorite. And it's a lot about Frank's backstory. And another one is Steph Penny's Tenderness of Wolves that has a really wonderful backstory for several characters because she tells it from different perspectives. But yeah, that's just my advice. Just try to write even just a little bit every single day, and just kind of keeps your hand in.
Yeah. Keeps your brain in it too.
Yep.
Yeah. Yeah. Thank you.
Oh, it was my pleasure. It was great to be here. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for joining us on this episode of Wayward Writers.
Let's connect. Find us at waywardwriters.com, X, Instagram, YouTube, and Facebook.
See you next time. Conquer your path.